Well, this is our opportunity to start to ask the questions that came up from those sessions, or to take that a bit further and to get them all to talk about a particular question. We don't have a roving mic, so if you could speak up, and what I'll do is repeat the question once it's been put forward, so that everyone can hear what you asked. So if I hand this microphone over, thanks, Antonella.
Okay, so it's one question with 3 steps. There's a lot of recognised studies on cultural differences, such as Hofstede. I'm just wondering, does the panel think, given your diverse backgrounds, whether that influences how societies either, say, acknowledge risks, their potential risks, their willingness to prepare for those risks, and their willingness to adopt lessons learned afterwards?
I think that question is for me, perhaps. Thank you. It's a very good question, I think, and it really points to the problems with the issue of trust, I think, because you have to consider the local context when working with trust issues. For instance, differences in income, differences in power structures, etc. That would really, you would really need to take that into account when trying to work with building social capital and trust. Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyone else? Thanks, Jen.
Just a very short something to add to that. I've worked for quite some time in Karlsruhe, which is at the border to France, and we've started looking there into, well, actually what we called at that time trans-border vulnerability, what we considered as the bad side of resilience, if you might say so. And we started looking at also how you can measure that, and trying to develop indicators or questions, assessments. And there is a huge problem in making only the data comparable. So, because the things that are measured are very different depending on if you are in France, in Switzerland, or in Germany. So that was the region where we worked. And also looking at risk management or risk preparedness plans reveals a lot about very different cultures and cultural backgrounds. And what we have tried to do there is, first of all, raising awareness so that people are able to help each other in case something really starts going wrong. In Australia, you probably don't have that problem so much that you can't even understand your neighbor. Yeah, because he's French or German. Well, but in Europe that actually exists and is a very important problem.
Thank you, Tina. Can I take another question, please? Or just get the microphone across to you.
Thanks. Really enjoyed the presentations, and I think when I think about disaster resilience, the things that often come to mind are fires, floods and earthquakes. Yet I've been, I suppose, fortunately involved in some work recently in South Australia, which you may be aware, we went through what's been coined the Millennium Drought. It's the worst drought on record. Resulted in significant social stress, suicides, financial impacts. And one of the things in reviewing it that really came out was the slow creeping insidious nature of it. It wasn't something that happened and then was finished. It began and built up and just kept going on with no real knowledge of when it would end. And we're still dealing with some of the legacy issues now. So my question is, given, I suppose, your collective brains and views on disaster resilience, how do you think we should deal with such a thing as I suppose, a creeping disaster like drought as compared with other disasters?
Just while the panel are working themselves out in that respect, I really am attracted to the notion of disruptive challenges, with the fact that there is somewhat of a grey space between what traditionally we might call an overwhelming disaster and something that really challenges a community in terms of its sustainability or its safety and health. And I think there are very many things in those spaces, including the loss of employment due to a major provider leaving town, drought and other things. So, important question, I think, guys.
I don't really know the answer to that question, but I think that building resilience is more than what we can imagine today, in the sense that the community, because resilience is also based on self-organization of the community might develop some mechanisms that we might not be aware of, but that can be instilled in the process of building resilience. So even in the case of those creeping disasters, I think that the community might self-organize itself to address those disaster effects. I'm happy to be.
I think Jürgen also wanted to add something, but for me this is very importantly pointing out that disaster management and risk management is not something that you do once and then you're done with it because you have the plan that is going to work for the next 10 years. So it is really important to understand that as a continuous process. And what I said before, continuously trying to understand what is going on out there, even if it may be something that you don't want to be going on out there. And there it is very important to help people, what I call in a nice word, learning. So continuously trying to learn about what are the drivers that may be important for us with risk perspective in future. And there it may also be very relevant to look at models that extrapolate, because usually when we make intuitive assessments, what may be important for us, humans tend to think that it will not be that bad and have a problem when there are what is called technically non-linearity. So when some developments like start what you call creeping disasters and then all of a sudden it blows up. That's a problem we also have with climate change because it is so hard to assess. And then models can be helpful in the sense that they provide a learning signal. So it is both aspects. On the one hand, monitor, try to understand what's going on out there, and on the other hand, also get expertise, get people on board who can help you in understanding what actually it means, what you monitor.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't think it's only about continuity, continuously improving. I also think that that kind of example really points to the difficulties with problems that you weren't aware of. So what I talked about was integrating risk assessment, risk management with other areas, and that is exactly what's going on. They are trying to integrate that with completely other areas, but areas that can be termed in a risk sense. So, for instance, public health, crime prevention, drug prevention, domestic violence, environmental issues, any kinds of issues. Because if you integrate the system and do continuously assessments, it's possible to pick up the very early signs of here's something going on. And that is something very important, I think, that normally does not happen, to pick up the early signs of problems.
It's also, I think, worth remembering that we tend to focus, particularly in this country, on the sudden onset, the severe impact events that we call disasters, and then all sorts of other situations that are longer term. Sometimes we talk about prolonged disasters, but actually the recovery part can, in any disaster, be decades long, or on average 10 years long. You think about Haiti and how long it will be before Haiti returns to the economic status that it had before the last disaster. And I'm also constantly reminded by colleagues in Indonesia of the Surabaya mud volcano. Some of you will know about that. Do you know about that? A thing that is oozing mud and burying villages, and has been for the last 3 or 5 years, and will do for the next couple of decades, slowly creep across the landscape and bury the livelihoods of all sorts of people. That's a slow onset, slow progress disaster that we need to think about as well. It really challenges the fabric of society, those kinds of events. Other questions? Please.
I'm in the community capacity building world. And it's interesting because my research has been in the city of Onkaparinga following community leaders, 19 community leaders, and using complex systems leadership theories for my research. So it's very interesting that I'll talk over drinks. The community capacity building world with a focus on networks, organisations, attitude, leadership skills, and that relationship to resilience. And I guess my interest is on the interface of those two worlds because we've got such a big body of knowledge. We've got stronger families and communities evaluation at a national level. So there's a whole lot of work that's been done with regards to building the capacity of communities to manage change. And I'm just wondering about if there's any linkage between those two bodies of work.
So the two bodies would be?
The resilience and the community capacity building.
So resilience and community capacity building as a mechanism, community development, I suppose.
Well, I see it differently. It focuses on strengthening communities rather than so it's making communities stronger so they can manage change. Whether that comes from, it doesn't have to be development, it could be from a natural disaster. It's just about building the networks, the organisations, attitudes, leadership skills. So it's that strengthening of communities.
So resilience against community strengthening, I suppose.
A second, please.
You can refuse, Antonella, to answer the
No,
question.
I'm just-
No, I'm not answering that question. Work it out for yourself. Can I say, just while they're thinking, a couple of responses to that? Because I was part of a federal government organised community resilience roundtable some years ago, which I found really interesting because it was attended by, the Insurance Council, the ABC, Red Cross, lots of NGOs, lots of government departments, and so on. And the thing that struck me was that most organisations in communities, working in communities, particularly probably the NGOs that go in and want to do good things, do their own good thing, and they don't feel that in the disaster resilience space there is a framework that's detailed enough for them to say, well, if we talk to each other because we're both working in this community, I could do some of this because we're good at that, and you could do some of that, and we have a stronger and better impact. That kind of joining together of the efforts of, well-intentioned organisations and people is something that's hard to do if you can't see a picture that you can relate to, I suppose. I don't know what you think about that, but I think that was something that really struck me about that situation.
Thanks, Paul, for seeing me. Well, I think that there is what your question makes me think about is the difference between personal resilience and community resilience. I think that I think of community resilience as a different thing. So strengthening is something that associates more with personal resilience, whereas in a community, I don't necessarily, my aim is not necessarily to make individuals stronger, but to, for example, to make sure that connections between different members of the community happen.
And that's the same community capacity building, so I'm just wondering, so the focus is on the community networks between the organisations.
We'll have to talk about this later, I'm sorry. By the way, I'm an engineer, so I'm not a sociologist. So I'm trying, my approach is trying to be socio-technical.
Yeah.
However, I might have a more engineer-like approach, which is
I can
more...
only say goodness to that. I'm not a social scientist, I don't know where to go with that. There is, I think the strengthening word is becoming problematic too. I think not because it's a problem, but because it's easier. And we see, particularly in the United Kingdom, where resilience became such a buzzword and was, developed ahead of Australia. People now talking about the fact that what we've done is to build stronger stuff, higher walls and more protection around our critical infrastructure or whatever it might be. And what we're finding much more difficult is the other stuff. You can throw a certain amount of money at making it stronger if it's an engineering problem, but if it's a social problem, that's a bit more difficult. So maybe that's the challenge now. Yeah, do you want to?
Just one thing, what I just said to Antonella is that I think for both of us, it is quite hard to understand what actually means strengthening, capacity building, and so on here. Because even the terms that you see all over the place here, like resilience, can mean anything. Also another term like risk or so, it is very hard to understand, and also something like strengthening. You can strengthen infrastructure from a technical perspective. Of course you can. You can always build higher dams, which helps you, as long as the disasters are a flood, so what you might expect, and as long as they are within the regime of the normal. So a dam can be very unprotective, or what you saw in Fukushima with the tsunami, where the earthquake was just of a magnitude that was unexpected, when it goes beyond that. So in that sense, I think even that having two well-protected critical infrastructures coupled with believing that you are safe is a bit like sitting on the Titanic. Yeah, because you believe so much that you are protected, and your risk assessment tells you that all lights are green, and then stopping these processes because we believe, well, our systems are, the best in the world and nothing is going to hit us, can actually undermine also resilience and lead to greater vulnerability.
Okay, I think there was a question at the front. Was that a follow-on question? Or?
Yeah, it was.
Sure, I'll get you a microphone.
It's just more along, direct back to this lady about social strengthening, and a lot back over already about the views when it comes to, I think one of the aftermaths of the Queensland floods has been the strengthening of the social bonds, and actually that puts in place that community resilience. But how do you actually do that without having the disasters which actually prompt those sort of connections to happen? And I think to build social resilience, I'm thinking, how do we do that before we, without the disaster, how do we build that resilience in the community?
So I guess just for our guests, I would think this is a question that speaks to, actually, and maybe surprisingly, the relative lack of real experience in Australia, and particularly perhaps in some states. South Australia might be an example, where without the impact, you're not challenged to think about the issues or learn lessons. So I guess for us, there is a sense of lack of experience.
Well, actually, there is a point where we have points in time, because I know I was living up in the hills for Ash Wednesday, and the bonds that formed out of that were very strong. Yeah. However, without reinforcement of those bonds, that break down, and within 5 years it turned back to what it was. So there's another part that comes, an add-on question again, is without that continual stimulus to build it, how do you actually, one, build in the social resilience, but then two, maintain that social, or build on that resilience afterwards?
Well, for the first question, how to build social resilience, I would call that. I would also like to contradict what you're saying a little bit, or put some nuance into it, because the bonds are only strengthened after an incident if it turns out well. If it doesn't, it can actually create some controversies. And also in societies where there are big class differences, there might be some arising problems after the incident. And the perfect example for that is the Hurricane Katrina, where the black community were really badly treated. And when it comes to keeping or maintaining the strong bonds, that is absolutely important. And that is exactly where the issue of trust comes in.
Bonds in your example.
Yeah. Great. Okay.
And I think that's also what shows you that it is not enough to turn all that resilience story into something that's very, very cumbersome, and that is a large part of an effort. So it should be something where you can benefit from also in day-to-day life. Because however hard you try, you're not going to keep strong bonds that are an effort to keep over 10 years or more when you perceive it as a continuous effort. So really having these kinds of community events give the people some fun or some benefit also in everyday life, because otherwise I think we all can say that nobody of us would be willing to invest a lot in something that you don't want to happen, you are not sure that it will happen, that you are actually will be still living in that very same community, and that is every day a huge effort. You wouldn't do that, so turn these relationships also into something that's useful.
I think adding to that, it's worth saying that because the attention goes away, most communities around the world, the attention doesn't last long after a disaster. The politics and the funding fade away, and people become more complacent sometimes. One of the things you can do is focus on practices that have some other hook, that have some other purpose, but build resilience.
Yeah.
So, in my world, I would argue if we required that new drivers had a first aid certificate, just as part of our road trauma and our community safety program, then that would be really useful in a disaster. Right? It's building community resilience, those kinds of things. Is there another question? There was one in the blue shirt, straight back.
I've got a question to Jürgen. You brought up the idea of subsidiarity, and I think this can become as popular as resilience as a concept, and overused. We enjoyed at Black Saturday bushfires, and one of the popular anecdotes is communities that were really well put together, vibrant communities, were doing fine until the help arrived. And what I think subsidiarity and pushing decision-making power and resilience down to community level is terrific. Until the forces of the state then come and the disaster relief NGOs come in and override that community, I'm interested how Sweden goes about protecting that idea of community when it's actually in a crisis.
Well, we have a long tradition in Sweden of relying on the institutions. So we are very bad at community work and strengthening communities. And that is still going on. And I think it's a political project that is actually happening now to shift the responsibility to a more local level and to communities. So that is actually part of the neoliberal governance, I would say. And yes, we are not very good. No, we are not very good at that in Sweden.
Other questions, please? Yeah. Brent.
Thank you. With such a well-travelled and international panel, just looking for some general comments. I read something a couple of years ago, I don't know what sort of research underpinned it, and it said your average family in Bangladesh is more resilient than a family in Australia. In developed nations, we've obviously got lots of resources, but we're not probably as connected as we used to be. I know in Australia we don't know our neighbours like we used to. I guess Bangladesh, they're probably more connected to each other, that have less resources available. So general comments on are there nations developing or developed that are more resilient or have a greater focus on building resilience? Now, who's at the forefront of this work, or are there nations out there now because of cultural or other reasons that are far more resilient than perhaps a nation like Australia?
It's a really difficult question, a good one, I think, relevant. One of the reasons that why I came here is because of the Torrance Resilience Institute. I think you are doing a really good job, both in academic terms and putting this tool together.
Would you like to say more about that?
But when it comes to more hands-on resilience and in practical terms, I actually have no idea. But the thing is about talking about Bangladesh and other very poor countries, they might be able to come back to the normal state fairly quick because the gap isn't that big. So that might be the reason. But I'm not sure. Maybe you have something to say about it.
Well, all these kinds of studies are basically also a measurement problem. So when you quote something like that, you would first of all have to have a look at what actually did they measure and what is for them actually resilience. I mean, in developed countries, of course, there is the advantage of that you have a very good healthcare system usually, and when that is not too much effective, then you can use it. So basically actually saying resilience using that framework is higher here than anywhere else, you could distract some implications from it, but if that means that if a certain event strikes Bangladesh or Sweden, for instance, which society would recover more quick is very different to say from that kind of state.
Yeah, certainly that. And also, maybe they are more resilient, but I'm pretty sure that they wouldn't be as much disaster prepared as Australia, for example. So while they, at a conference that was last year, I heard that, for example, in Bangladesh, the fisher who has a boat, and he knows that a cyclone was about to arrive, the researchers said, why don't you protect your boat? They said, oh, I'm just going to build another one when the cyclone is over. And that's how the resilience works. However, in terms of preparing themselves to disasters, then they don't actually have that kind of preparedness, I suppose. And also, resilience is not a concept which has a limit, I don't think. So how, even like when we measure resilience, how can we actually say that system is going to resist anything? We just don't know. We prepare our systems as much as we can, but we just don't know what's going to happen, and we don't know how resilient ultimately the system is going to be.
Then just the last remark also going to what you already said. I mean, resilience refers usually to the ability to keep the system or get back to the initial state as quickly as possible and as good as possible. But when your actual state is very, very low, of course that's then easier to get back there. But this is probably not what you want in terms of resilience or as a society.
And I guess just in terms of throwing a rock in the pond, the other issue is that I think resilience is a question of civil society. It's about politics and expectations and so forth. And so, you know, what might be an acceptable level of resilience or even defined as resilience in one country is different from another. We have seen a number of countries, particularly in Europe, the US, China and the UK, if you don't count them as Europe, and Australia, a bunch of countries getting together to talk about resilience frameworks now. So the terminology and the thinking is starting to gain traction in a few countries, but not globally at all. And globally we're still very much stuck in disaster risk reduction, the old Hyogo framework idea, which of course itself will be reviewed. So the Hyogo framework for disaster risk reduction runs out in 2015. Conversations now are starting about what it might be in the future, so that's something to think about and contribute to as well. We might take one more question because we're at just about at 6 o'clock. So if we can have one more question, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter Hayes, Perfect Northern Volunteering. Since I've only got one question, I'd really love to catch up with you afterwards and have a bit of a chat about we're working on a project with spontaneous volunteers, part of that community support that rises after disaster. But we'll catch up afterwards on that. I was fortunate enough to go last night to Martin Selwick, who is working on positive psychology. And he talked a lot about well-being, individual well-being and community well-being. And he also highlighted a study that had been conducted in Europe, and part of that was looking at well-being, a measure of well-being in the countries. And he mentioned actually the Danish were the highest, 40% had a very high sense of well-being. Are you able to make some comments about the sense of that measure of well-being and the relationship between that and community resilience and the ability of communities
to handle complex situations?
They're tough questions tonight. I bet you're glad you're out there, not over here.
When they are not able to say anything, they say, well, that's a question for sociologists.
At last a question a sociologist can answer.
I must say, unfortunately enough, I really don't like the concept of measuring well-being in those terms. Instead, I would really encourage you all to go and have a look at the Happy Planet Index if you haven't seen it. It's a measure where they take into account not only what people answer regarding well-being, but also the carbon footprint of the country, and something else I can't remember, unfortunately. Yeah, the rate of infant mortality. Yeah, thank you. So that adding those things, I assume that Denmark wouldn't end up in trouble, actually. I know that Sweden is on 54th place, and poorer country like Bangladesh, like you mentioned, they are much higher. So I have a bit of problem with the well-being measure. And I really don't think that people in general take into account if their sense of vulnerability and resilience, actually. So I don't think those two are connected at all. But that's just an assumption.
Okay, thank you. I think we might have to stop at that stage, but there will be plenty of opportunity to talk to these guys during the wrap-up and networking session. Before you make too much movement and noise, I've got a couple of things I still need to say, because I need to thank you guys for your interest, an extraordinary number of people interested in this session, and for your questions. I especially need to thank the speakers who are lined up, Jorgen, Tina and Antonella. And of course Adelaide University for their support of the team and for putting on these kinds of sessions for the community in South Australia. Finally, of course, the main sponsors for the event that are on the screen, the Australian Government, the Government of South Australia, and of course we talked about University of Adelaide. So thanks to all of those people. I am now in a bit of a rush to wind up, because I've started to get SMSs on my phone with commentary on what I say. So I read one and I thought I'd better put it down. So we should stop. We do have some gifts for the speakers, and Antonella's just going to grab those and hand them to our guests. Somebody mentioned the importance of the winery industry to resilience in South Australia. We talked about that. And so I think we're giving a good read to everyone so that they can think more deeply about these issues. And whatever it is you do over a good read. Oh. Okay. When we do stop, when Antonella's had the opportunity to do that, I'll ask you to thank the guests, but just while she is, because we've had to move into this kind of room, we are moving to another room for the networking session, which is on the 5th floor. It's the Wardy room on the 5th floor, the common room. So if you follow all of us, or follow everyone else, that'd be a great place to have a final talk. No. So thank you to the speakers, Jorgen, Tina and Antonella. And if you can show your